In the unforgiving wilds of the Old West, a weathered rancher and a quiet 7-year-old girl are bound by a fragile, unspoken trust. Their connection is tested by debts, power, and a land that shows no mercy. Between them lies a choice that will cost more than either can afford, yet bind their fates forever.
The wind came first, long before the rain, before the lightning began clawing across the black Wyoming sky. It swept over the empty plains in violent, circling gusts, bending the sagebrush, rattling the loose boards of Samuel Cutter's wagon as his horse strained against the harness. He knew this kind of wind. It came fast, mean, and with a weight behind it that spoke of worse things waiting in the dark. The mare skittered sideways at a sudden flash, white fire tearing across the horizon. Samuel's gloved hand tightened on the reins, jaw hard beneath the shadow of his hat. He was 2 miles out from his ranch house, but 2 miles in a storm like this could just as well be 20. The sound of rushing water echoed faintly from somewhere far off, the kind of sound that makes a man listen harder. He pulled the coat collar higher against his neck, forcing the horse forward. The rain broke in an instant, sheets of water that hammered down so violently it blurred the land into shifting shadows. Samuel's hat brim was useless, his vision a half-blind haze of wind-driven rain. His horse screamed and reared as a crack of lightning lit the sky and split the ground nearby. Samuel's boots slipped on the slick boards of the wagon as he fought to steady her, but the world lurched, tilted, and then there was nothing but weightlessness and cold. The wagon overturned in the wash of rising floodwater. Samuel's shoulder struck something hard before the icy water closed over him. His hat was gone. The cold punched the air from his lungs. He came up choking, blind, his boots tangling in submerged brush as the current dragged him. His fingers clawed for something solid. The water pulled harder. And then, a shape. Small, blurred in the rain, standing on the edge of the current. A voice, high, frightened, but cutting through the roar. He felt a tug. A rope? No. Something rough, like fabric twig, stared into a crude line. His hand caught it, numb fingers locking on. Small hands braced, the figure leaning back with all its might. Inch by inch, Samuel found purchase, dragging himself from the current. He collapsed onto the mud, coughing hard, chest aching like it might tear apart. Through the rain, he saw her properly for the first time. A girl, no more than 7 years old, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her face. She stared at him with wide eyes, neither speaking nor moving. She wore a faded dress several sizes too large, tied at the waist with a strip of cloth. Her bare feet were caked in mud. Samuel blinked hard, forcing himself upright. "Where?" he managed, his voice rough. But she didn't answer, just stood there, breathing hard, clutching the knotted strip of fabric she'd used to drag him in. The wind screamed over the plain again. The rain was heavier now. Samuel's strength was going fast, and the girl's thin shoulders shivered violently. Without another word, he reached for her, lifting her small frame against him. She tensed at first, then went still, as though deciding not to fight. They staggered through the wet dark together. When Samuel woke again, it was to the creak of his cabin roof and the muted hiss of rain easing at last. His shoulder burned. His ribs ached when he drew breath. The fire in the hearth was little more than embers. He pushed himself upright in his bed, glancing around. The girl sat on the floor near the fire. She had Samuel's old blanket wrapped around her narrow frame, her wet hair now a tangle of drying strands. In her hands she turned a small wooden carving over and over, tracing its shape with careful fingers. Samuel's voice was low, steady. "You got a name, girl?" She didn't look up. "You hungry?" He tried again. A pause, then the smallest nod. Samuel rose stiffly, moving to the shelf. He set a plate of leftover biscuits on the table. She watched him from the corner of her eye, but didn't move. He gestured. "Go on. Ain't much, but it's food." She approached slowly, sat at the table, and ate in silence. After a moment, Samuel spoke again, quieter this time. "Where's your folks?" She didn't answer, just kept eating, small bites. Samuel studied her. No shoes, no coat. A wooden carving she kept close. She hadn't spoken a word to him, but she hadn't run either. He could see the way her eyes flicked to the door now and then, measuring distance, escape. "You can stay tonight," he said finally. "Tomorrow we'll see about finding kin." She looked at him properly then, eyes sharp despite her size. He didn't press her for more. The next day, the land lay slick and heavy under a low sky. Samuel stepped outside to check the fence line, pausing when he saw the girl in the yard. She stood near the corral, small hands resting against the weathered rail, watching the cattle with quiet intensity. "You've got a name?" he asked again, gentler now. After a long pause, she answered without looking at him. "Clara." "That it?" "Clara what?" She shrugged, still watching the animals. Samuel didn't press. The days passed. Clara remained silent most of the time, slipping into the quiet rhythm of the ranch. She fed the hens without being asked, swept the porch in her awkward way. Samuel tried not to notice the way her eyes seemed older than her years, or the way she flinched at loud noises. His own troubles were mounting. The ranch had been bleeding money for months, debts piling high to Elias Kane, the richest and most ruthless landholder in the county. Kane had a long memory for what he believed was owed. One night a storm rolled across the plains again, less violent than the one before, but sharp enough to drive the cattle restless. Samuel went out to check them, finding Clara already near the pen, mud up to her ankles. She was trying to close a loose gate, small hands straining. "Girl, what are you doing out here, Samuels?" Elle barked, moving to take over. "The cows were getting out," she said simply, voice steady. Her calm startled him almost as much as her presence. He tightened the gate and checked the herd. By the time they returned to the cabin, both were soaked through. Clara never complained once. Samuel said nothing, but that night, as she sat near the fire carving something from a scrap of wood, he found himself watching her. She was more than just a child stranded on the plains. She was deliberate. A week later, the sheriff rode in. Samuel stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sheriff?" "Samuel." The lawman's tone was careful, almost apologetic. "Got news. Kane's called your debt. Full amount, due at week's end." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You know I ain't got that kind of money." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Which means the ranch goes to auction. Everything. You can bid, but—" Samuel cut him off with a bitter laugh. "With what money?" The sheriff hesitated, glancing toward the cabin where Clara stood in the doorway watching. "And there's more. That girl. Kane's bringing up the vagrancy statute. Says she's got no guardian on record." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "She's under my care." "Not officially," the sheriff said. "Kane'll use it. You know he will." Samuel looked back at Clara. She didn't flinch under his gaze, though her small fingers tightened around the wooden carving she always carried. The sheriff shifted in the saddle. "I don't like it, Sam. But you've got 7 days. Make what peace you can." The hoofbeats faded, leaving only the sound of the wind moving over the grass. Samuel stood there a long moment before turning back inside. Clara was still in the doorway. "They're going to take the ranch?" she asked, voice calm but direct. Samuel hesitated. "Maybe." She studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded, as though she'd known the answer all along. She. That night, Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Clara carved silently in her corner. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faint creak of a weathered sign in town that would, in a week's time, read, "Auction, property of Elias Kane." The sky over Dry Creek was a brittle, colourless grey the morning Samuel Cutter rode into town. The kind of sky that seemed to drain the land beneath it, robbing colour from buildings, from the dust, from the people gathered in uneasy clusters outside the courthouse steps. The auction block had been built in the square, fresh timbers nailed together in a hurry, the smell of cut pine still clinging faintly to the air. Samuel sat straight in the saddle, his coat pulled close against the wind. Clara rode behind him, silent as she always was in public, her small hands gripping the back of his belt. The sound of hoofbeats on packed dirt echoed faintly between the boardwalks. Folks turned to watch him pass. Some nodded. Most didn't. At the front of the square, Elias Kane stood on the courthouse porch like a man surveying property he already owned. His dark coat was immaculate, his boots polished despite the dust. Two of his hired men lounged nearby, rifles resting loosely in their hands. Kane's thin mouth pulled into something resembling a smile as he saw Samuel approach.
"Cutter!"
he called, voice carrying easily.
"Didn't expect you'd bother showing. Most men prefer to avoid the spectacle of their own ruin."
Samuel dismounted without answering. He reached up and lifted Clara down, setting her carefully on the ground. She looked up at Kane, her expression unreadable, then turned her gaze to the crowd. The sheriff stepped forward.
"We'll keep this orderly,"
he announced. His voice was firm, but Samuel could see the tension in the man's jaw. This was Kane's show, and everyone knew it. The auction began. One by one, Samuel's possessions went across the block. A saddle, tools, the wagon he'd nearly died in. Each item was sold for a fraction of its worth, Kane's men buying most of it with practiced efficiency. The ranch itself followed, 160 acres of hard-earned land, sold for an insult of a price. Kane signed the deed with a flourish. Through it all, Samuel stood silent, shoulders squared, Clara close beside him. Then Kane spoke again, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "And there's the matter of the girl." The sheriff stiffened.
"Kane, she's an orphan,"
Kane interrupted smoothly.
"No legal guardian. The vagrancy statute is clear. She can't just wander the territory. She needs proper placement."
The words landed heavy in the air. Samuel felt Clara's small hand tighten in his coat. He stepped forward, voice low but sharp. "She's under my care."
"Not in the eyes of the law,"
Kane replied, his voice dripping false sympathy. "But of course there's a remedy for that. She can be auctioned, just like everything else you've lost. A fair chance for someone to claim responsibility." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked away, others shifted uneasily, but no one spoke against him. The sheriff's jaw worked.
"We can't."
Kane cut him off.
"We can, and we will."
His gaze swept the square.
"Bidding starts at $5.
No one moved. $5 was more than most were willing to pay for another mouth to feed, especially a child with no blood ties. Kane's men smirked. Kane himself looked entirely too pleased. "I'll take her for $5, Kane said at last, his voice carrying in the silence. Samuel's fists clenched. His mind raced, but he had nothing. No land, no cattle, no money. And then another voice spoke. Deep, steady. $1. The crowd turned. A man stepped from the edge of the square. Tall, broad-shouldered. His hair was dark, his clothing plain but well kept. His face was marked by years of weather, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were sharp, fixed on Kane with an intensity that made the air feel different. Kane's smile faltered. "This isn't a game," he said coldly. The man ignored him. $1, he repeated. The sheriff cleared his throat.
"It's an open bid. Are there any other offers?"
Silence. Kane's jaw tightened.
His pride warred with the spectacle of being defied in public. But even he wasn't foolish enough to drive the bid higher for a child he wanted only to spite Cutter. $1 then, the sheriff said at last, his voice carrying across the square. Sold. The man stepped forward, handing over the coin. Kane's men watched him with thinly veiled hostility, but he didn't so much as glance their way. Instead, he turned to Samuel. "You'll want to leave this place quick," he said simply. Samuel studied him for a long moment. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He just started walking. Samuel hesitated, then lifted Clara back into the saddle and mounted. The stranger led the way out of town. They rode in silence, the road stretching empty ahead. Kane's land loomed far behind them, the sound of the town fading to nothing. The stranger's pace was steady, unhurried. Samuel's thoughts churned. Clara rode quietly, but he could feel her leaning against his back, her small weight a reminder of what had nearly happened. Finally, Samuel spoke. "Why'd you do it?" The stranger didn't look back. "Wasn't for you." "Then for who?" The man's shoulders shifted slightly, but he didn't answer. They camped that night in a stand of cottonwoods near the river. Samuel tended the fire while the stranger worked in silence, setting traps with practiced hands. Clara sat close to the flames, drying her hands. As night fell, Samuel noticed the stillness of the land around them. No sound of town, no signs of Kane's reach. But he also knew men like Kane didn't let grudges die easy. "You got a name?" Samuel asked the stranger. The man looked at him across the fire. "Red Elk." Samuel nodded slowly. "You know Kane's men will follow?" Red Elk glanced toward the dark horizon. "They'll try." Clara watched the exchange without speaking, her eyes shifting between them like she was measuring something unspoken. The next days were a blur of hard travel. The land turned rougher, the air colder. Supplies were thin. The silence between the three of them settled into a kind of rhythm. One evening, the sound of howls drifted across the plains. Wolves. Samuel felt the tension in the air tighten. Clara moved closer to the fire. Red Elk stood calm as ever and moved into the dark. Minutes later, a sharp yelp echoed from the distance, then silence. Red Elk returned with a fresh pelt over his shoulder. "They won't come closer now?" Clara's eyes lingered on the pelt, then on him. Without a word, she reached into her small bundle and pulled out the wooden carving she'd been working on. This one was shaped like a wolf. She set it near Red Elk's place by the fire and went back to her seat. He didn't speak, but the carving stayed where it was. As they rode on, Samuel's thoughts turned inward. He had lost everything. His land, his home, his livelihood. Clara's safety had hung on a single coin. He wondered what kind of man he was now, what kind of protector he could still be. One night, as the fire burned low, Red Elk spoke for the first time without prompting. "You measure a man by what he keeps. That's your mistake." Samuel looked at him. Red Elk's gaze was fixed on the flames. "A man's weight is in what he carries forward, not in what he's left behind." Samuel didn't answer, but the words stayed with him. By the 5th day, they reached the edge of the high country. The land stretched wide ahead, wild and unbroken. Red Elk stopped at a rise, scanning the horizon. "You've got enemies behind you," he said, "and a long trail ahead. Best you decide which road you're willing to take." Samuel looked at Clara. She was watching him quietly, waiting. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains ahead. Somewhere far behind them, Kane's men were no doubt waiting for the right moment. Samuel adjusted his grip on the reins. "Then we keep riding." Red Elk nodded once. They started forward again, the land swallowing the sound of their passing, leaving behind only the faint creak of leather and the whisper of wind over grass. The crossroads waited somewhere ahead. The wind changed first. Samuel felt it before he heard anything. Sharp, cold, carrying a scent that wasn't just pine and dust. It was iron, faint but unmistakable. Men had a smell to them when they hunted, and Kane's men had been on their trail too long to give up now. Red Elk's horse slowed on the narrow pass, his head turning slightly as if listening to something far away. Samuel knew better than to ask. Clara, riding with Samuel as she had since Dry Creek, straightened in the saddle. Her small fingers tightened in his coat. "Keep her close," Red Elk said finally, voice low. Samuel's hand went instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. The canyon ahead narrowed, rock walls climbing steep on either side. Bad ground for an ambush, unless you were the one doing the ambushing. They rode forward. The first shot cracked off the stone like a whip. Samuel yanked the reins, forcing the horse behind a jut of rock as splinters of shale showered them. Clara clung to him, silent but steady. Red Elk slid from his saddle in one smooth motion, bow in hand, moving like a shadow along the rocks. Another shot rang out, then another. Samuel leaned out just far enough to see Kane's men on the ridge, rifles braced. The next moments blurred. Samuel returned fire, the sound echoing in the narrow pass. Red Elk moved unseen, the snap of his bowstring followed by the heavy silence of a man dropping out of sight. Clara crouched low, small and still, her eyes fixed on Samuel's back. Then Kane himself appeared, higher on the ridge, his coat whipping in the wind. His voice carried easily down to them. "You think you can ride out with what's mounted? Ein cutter? You think you can just disappear?" Samuel's reply was cut short by another volley of shots. He fired back, his shoulder burning where a glancing shot had torn through the coat. Red Elk emerged briefly from the rocks, loosing another arrow that sent one of Kane's men sprawling. The air smelled of powder and blood. The wind roared through the pass. Finally, the gunfire slowed. Kane's voice called out again, sharper this time. "This ends now." Red Elk stepped out from the rocks, calm as ever, bow drawn. His voice was steady, but it carried like a hammer strike. "Yes, it does." The standoff hung in the air for a breath too long. Then Kane's eyes shifted, a flicker of something almost uncertain in his expression. He stepped back. Another of his men dropped, an arrow finding its mark, and then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. The ridge fell silent. Kane was gone. Samuel stayed still, rifle ready, until Red Elk lowered his bow. "They'll follow again," Samuel said quietly. "Not here," Red Elk answered. "Not today." They rode on in silence. The land changed as they left the pass, opening into a wide stretch of prairie broken by scattered stands of pine. The air felt different here, less heavy, but full of its own kind of weight. By late afternoon they reached a place where the road split. One trail ran south toward the settlements, the other curved west into country Samuel didn't recognize. Red Elk stopped at the divide. "This is where I leave you," he said. Samuel turned in the saddle. "That wasn't the deal." "There was no deal," Red Elk replied. "I brought you past Kane's Reach. What you do now is your own road." Samuel glanced west, then south. He could feel the weight of the decision in his bones. Kane's Reach would stretch far in the south. The west was unknown. Red Elk dismounted. He reached into his pack and drew out a small pouch, handing it to Clara. "Seeds," he said simply, "for a home yet to come." Clara looked at him, then at the pouch. She didn't speak, but her small hand closed around it. Samuel watched him,
a question hanging unsaid. But Red Elk had already turned, his horse moving along a faint trail that disappeared into the trees. The wind moved through the grass, the only sound for a long moment. Samuel looked down at Clara. She was staring at the two trails, her face calm but thoughtful. "Which way?" he asked quietly. She pointed west. Samuel nodded once. "West it is." They rode on. The sun dipped low, casting the land in gold and shadow. Behind them, the crossroads grew smaller, until it was only another point on the endless trail they'd already traveled. By the time they made camp that night, the air was cool, the stars sharp above them. Samuel built a small fire, the sound of crackling wood filling the quiet. Clara sat across from him, her hands busy with the small wooden carving again. "You know," Samuel said after a long silence, "I don't know what waits out there." Clara didn't look up. "We'll find out." Her voice was steady, as if the unknown was no more dangerous than the storms they'd already walked through. Samuel leaned back, looking at the stars. He'd lost his land, his home, nearly everything that had once anchored him. But somewhere along the trail, the weight of loss had shifted. What mattered now was ahead, not behind. Days passed. The land changed again, rolling hills, stands of cedar, a river cutting deep through red stone. The journey was hard, the food scarce, but there was a strange steadiness in their pace. One evening they stopped on a ridge overlooking a wide valley. The grass moved like water in the wind, and far off Samuel could see a line of cottonwoods marking the course of the river. "This is it," he said quietly. Clara looked out at the valley, her expression unreadable. She reached into her bundle and pulled out the pouch of seeds Red Elk had given her. Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a mix of weight and lightness all at once. They set camp at the valley's edge that night. Samuel didn't know what the days ahead would bring, whether Cain would find them, whether the land would yield anything worth keeping. But he knew this. They'd crossed more than miles to get here. In the morning, the sun broke over the horizon, catching on the river below. Samuel stood at the edge of camp, the light warming his face. Clara came to stand beside him, her small frame solid against the wind. "They say a man's wealth is in his land, in his cattle," Samuel said softly. "Maybe they're wrong." Clara didn't answer. She just opened her hand, letting a single seed rest in her palm. Samuel looked at it, then at the valleys stretching wide before them. The crossroads was far behind now. What lay ahead was theirs alone to walk,